So the moment that Jesus arrives from the other side, he's met by a religious leader. And you'll remember that when they went to the other side to begin with, the Gentile side, the unclean side, they faced a storm internally and in the waters. So it would be right to think that when Jesus crosses again back to the other side, the religious leadership will be there to chastise him for what he has done, making himself unclean. But that is not what happens. Instead, this powerful person comes and drops at the feet of Jesus and begs him to save his 12-year-old daughter. And Jesus says nothing. He just responds to this plea by getting up and going with him. Compassion moves him without her. But as he's walking along, something happens in this great crowd. There's a woman who touches his clothing, and Jesus notices it. And this woman is not given a name, unlike the leader of the synagogue. But what we do know about her is that she has been bleeding for 12 years and suffered under many physicians. And what this means by religious law is that she was ritually unclean. That if she was to touch another human being, particularly a man, that she would make that person ritually impure. Her very touch was unwelcome in the religious community. And in fact, in order to keep this from happening, she would have probably been required to walk around when there were other people present saying, "Unclean, unclean," so that they wouldn't worry about touching her. She is unnamed in the story, but her identity is simply that of unclean. Except on this day. On this day, she decides that enough is enough and takes matters into her own hands. And she secretly works her way through the crowd, knowing that if they knew, she would be in trouble. But she believes, finally, after all this time, if she could finally just touch Jesus' clothes, that healing will come. I mean, after this, all these physicians, what harm could it do? And she does this knowing that with each person she bumps up against and has to push through, that she is breaking the religious law. But possibility is worth it. And it's worth it until Jesus calls her out. You can only imagine that when she hears this, that she thinks she could just get away with touching his clothes because all those people are touching him. How will he even notice? And yet he does. And so terror has to race through her bones as she comes forward to admit what she has done. Like the leader of the synagogue, drops to her knees before Jesus and confesses what she has been living through, what she has done. And probably expected some level of condemnation. And instead, she gets grace. Even more than grace, she's commended for her great faith. In the presence of all of these people, she is given the accolades. This unknown woman, this unclean woman, is commended in front of the religious leadership and the whole community, and that means she's been brought to restoration. Her plan would have just healed her, but she still would have had to walk around and figure out how to explain she was no longer unclean. And in the end, this woman who was excluded and unwelcome now becomes part of the very community that had excluded her. And Jesus says nothing about the need for all of those folks in the crowd to deal with their ritual purity because it's no longer an issue, if it ever was in his eyes. But this is not the end of the story. Mark has this strange way of telling stories. We like to pick on him and say he's sort of like the Cliff Notes version of all the Gospels, the shortest. And, well, truth is, his Greek is the least educated of all of the other Gospels. But the odd thing is, he tells stories in such tightly structured ways, and particularly this one, that you know that any interruption in a story is no interruption at all. A woman suffering hemorrhages for 12 years, a 12-year-old daughter. And in fact, even the language that Jesus used with this grown woman is "my daughter," the same language that the leader of the synagogue uses with his daughter. These are both children of God. And just at the moment of healing and restoration, all of a sudden word comes from the crowd that the 12-year-old daughter has died. And Jesus turns to the religious leader and looks at him and says, "Have faith." It's a powerful contrast. That's really what this story is so much about. You have this woman who is seen as ritually impure and unwelcome in the faith community being the person who has great faith, and the religious leader is the one who has to be encouraged. Now, I'm not going to pick on him, because if my child was at the point of death, I certainly would need to be encouraged in my faith too. And when Jesus gets to the home, he notices all of this commotion. And he makes the announcement that the child is not dead, but only sleeping, and they all laugh. But the final scene then has James and John and Peter standing with the mother and father in a private place. And Jesus touches the child and says, "Get up." And she does. But then he tells them something odd, beyond "get her something to eat." He tells them not to tell anyone about what has happened, which begs the question, why? Why? After having this big fuss of a healing with this woman, why is it with the leader of the synagogue that it has to be private and a secret? That's important. Here's what I think is happening. Jairus, the leader of the religious community, has put himself somewhat in a difficult position. You see, he's gone to this troublesome healer because there was nowhere else for him to go. And he's fallen at his feet asking for help. It makes sense, because who wouldn't do everything in their power to save a loved one? But what if Jesus made this healing public like all of the other healings? The truth is, at some point down the road, this could cause trouble for Jairus. He could be seen as being part of this, and it might cost him his career, his life, his family, his position. Now again, as you know, we're in the unknown periods, and I'm driving my own interpretive truck into it. But follow me here. Notice that Jesus turns the crowd away. They come and say she's dead. He says, "Everyone go away, we're going on this alone." And then he tells the people out front that the child isn't even dead, just asleep, now go away. And at no time does Jesus ever publicly acknowledge that this child was actually dead. However, when all is said and done, the child turns out to be alive. And now the religious leader does not have to give credit to Jesus publicly. He can simply say Jesus was right, the child was just sleeping. Now, why would I say this? Well, down the road, it turns out that there are religious leaders who remain part of the religious leadership who become helpful not only to Jesus at the end of his life, but also to the disciples after they take over in Acts. That it's important to have a few folks in positions of power who can be sympathetic without having to be in the street with you. Jesus had provided healing and grace to this powerful person who begged him, and then he helped this person save face in what could have been a difficult time. Now maybe, just maybe, when things get tough and following Jesus becomes really troublesome, this religious leader can now provide healing and could provide support for Jesus and Jesus' followers, because he knows the truth without having to cost his own life. Who knows the exact reason? It is unclear why it is that Jesus chooses to make this one private and the other one very, very public. But what you almost find, what you almost find, for those who are asleep, you can now jump in. You can almost find at this point where the turning of the world upside down in the kingdom of God is all about. That those who are excluded and unnamed come to the center and are given honor, and those who are given honor are ushered to the sidelines to do their work in private. But here's the thing that does happen. No one in this loses their life. No one loses their dignity. And healing and restoration exists for all. In other words, Jesus isn't looking to turn the tables on the powerful, but to bring restitution and wholeness to the whole community. It's clear that Jesus is rejecting the choices of either or. He does not choose to save only the marginalized or only the powerful. And this points to an important value in the kingdom of God, which is this. The needs of the marginalized and the vulnerable come before the needs of the celebrated and the powerful. Now, in the kingdoms of the world, the celebrated and the powerful always receive first, and once that's done, whatever might be left might be trickled down to everyone else. The marginalized better not buy anything wrong with that trickle-down stuff either. That's the way the world works. The powerful get more, those who are honored get more, and those who are on the margins get blamed for being on the margins to begin with. But here in this passage, one of those simple kingdom values, where the needs of the marginalized and the vulnerable come before the celebrated and the powerful. Not instead of, that is the great fear. Not instead of, but before. The statement is important because in a conversation that I had this week, it came to its forefront. I was mentioning the political visit into our town. I'll kind of share it with you. Some of you may have heard that former Secretary of State, presidential hopeful Hillary Clinton, was in town this past week. She spoke at Christ UCC Church, where the Reverend Tracy Blackman is the pastor. Reverend Blackman, as many of you know, has been at the forefront of the protests in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement, and is also a member of the Ferguson Commission. Now, during that speech, of which I read, I and folks who were there noticed that Secretary Clinton used the words, "all lives matter." Now, for many of those gathered in that room, it was a slap in the face, if you're not aware of this. Because in some ways, the "all lives matter" has been used to push the "Black Lives Matter" to the sidelines, because, well, that just brings up all sorts of uncomfortable things. And after all, who can argue? Don't all lives matter? I'll come to that question in a minute. I was actually marveling at what political brilliance and move it was. As many of you know, in my political science and political background, I was really fascinated by the way that she was able to give a speech that wasn't intended for anybody in that room. But that's often how political folks work. In some circles, it can now be used for her to say, look, she's not as radical as you think she is. She was telling them something they needed to hear. And in other circles, she can say, look, I stood right with the activists in Ferguson. It's a brilliant political move. I'm not picking on her for that. She can do both without getting into too much trouble, but it is part of a long-standing political tradition. And I noticed this because I was at one point interested in being a campaign manager. Some of that might make you laugh, hopefully. But it reminded me of a time when then candidate Bill Clinton was speaking to Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Push Coalition in 1992. You might not remember this. But then he was comparing the words of the rapper Sister Souljah to that of David Duke, saying she was an extremist who I have nothing to do with and she needs to get herself straightened out following the uprising in Los Angeles. It provided him just the cover that he needed, because he was in the right place, but said the right words to the right crowd. This is how politics often works. And frankly, in our more modern is when candidate Obama did something similar with his long-term pastor, when his long-term pastor clearly became a liability for his electability. I share this really not as criticism, but to remind you that when it happens, well, the Democrats are not alone. There's a long list of Republicans, and I thought I'd leave that alone since most of you know my own politics. I share it because I shared this original story to point out sort of the way of politics, which is what I just did there. And in response, one of my friends, who's a sweet and kind person who has no guile whatsoever, said, well, don't all lives matter? And to this question, I say unequivocally, yes, all lives in fact do matter. Unfortunately, it is clear, if we are remotely aware of what's going on in our own time and place, that black lives and brown lives in this country do not matter in the same way. There are too many things to point this out. And this is why we have to emphasize this basic truth. The needs of those who've been marginalized have to come the needs before those who've been most comfortable. And so to replace black lives with all lives is a way of ignoring the harsh reality And if we are not careful, we will continue to act like all lives matter when the results all around us prove otherwise. And so it occurred to me that this is what this passage is in fact all about. It's a way of reminding us that things are not right, that there are marginalized people, and we need to attend to those first because the world's not going to do it. It's not the job of politicians to get up and be radical in those settings, but it certainly is the job of the activists to stand up and go, well, in my church, Black Lives Matter too, first. Which is what she did, but that didn't get credit. Jairus' daughter matters to Jesus in the same way that this unnamed child of privilege does. But this unnamed child of privilege has quite fervor all around her, while this unwelcome, unclean woman is left to her own devices. So Jesus goes there first. What if Jesus, faced with the needs of the powerful, says to this marginalized, hang on, I got to deal with the wealthy folk first, I'll come back and take care of you when I'm done. But this woman has to step out. Jesus takes the time to emphasize this. In fact, it is her taking the initiative. It's not Jesus going, oh, let me go over here. Jesus didn't have anything to do with it. You notice that's what happens in the passage, right? The power goes out of him. He didn't have anything to do with it. That's why he turns. But he takes then the initiative to give her credit in a really public way. Not to shame her, but to bring restoration and wholeness. He deals with her first. He frees her first. He celebrates her first. And then he goes to the home of powerful and brings restoration and healing in secret. This week we buried 9 of our brothers and sisters in South Carolina in a very public way, as the United States was right there. But the truth is, too often, lives and property in the black community lost their churches this week. In a period of 6 days, there were 5 of them that were burned to the ground or destroyed substantially. On the 21st of this past week, College Hills Seventh-day Adventist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee was burned. On the 23rd, God's Power Church of Christ in Macon, Georgia was burned. On the 24th, Briar Creek Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina was burned. On the 26th, Grover, that's 2 words, Grover Baptist Church was burned in Lawrenceville, South Carolina. And then on the 26th also, Greater Miracle Apostolic Holiness Church in Tallahassee, Florida was burned. And there is no national outrage about this because, well, they're not particularly powerful congregations. Where are the voices looking to call out for this and a national response? And it brings back the harsh reality, the sad truth, that in our culture, all lives don't matter in the same way. That's why some people can get more life insurance than others. It's not just about how much you can pay. If you're killed by some corporation, depending on your worth as a human being in dollars and cents, is how much you might be able to sue that corporation for. The truth is, some lives do matter more than others. In our courts, in our schools, in our hospitals, in our neighborhoods, and in our prisons. Some lives just don't count as much as others. And until we can acknowledge that openly, we need to hold off on saying, well, all lives matter. And it's as people of faith that we're called to break that cycle. It doesn't need necessarily to be part of some great plan or project, though that would be rather welcome. So if you have access to that, we'd love to talk and see what we can do. But see, here's the fallacy. In our own culture, we believe that if we don't have access to powerful, we can't do something. But like that woman who said, enough is enough. She did what she could, not expecting anybody to know. She just reached out. Those simple acts can bring healing and wholeness, not just for ourselves, because she was restored to the whole community. And they found healing, finding out that maybe this whole unclean thing might not have been such a good idea after after all, because now she can talk about her experience. If they'll only listen. But we do not need to believe the lie that there is nothing we can do. We all have something in us that can make a change. We don't have to put up with anything. That woman certainly didn't put up with it anymore. So wherever you need to get to with putting up with things, find that enough is enough in your own lives. All we have to do is remember this story and this simple truth. In our own daily action, the needs of the marginalized and the vulnerable have to come first, before, not instead of, but before the needs of the celebrated and powerful. And then that can be the guide for our actions, for our work, where we spend our energy, where we spend our time, and we can focus on those most in need first, putting our bodies and selves right where no one else cares. It really is that simple. When we stop celebrating the celebrated and look for those who've been ignored, marginalized, and told they were unclean. And remember, it is this marginalized woman who had the power to take the first step, to do what she had to do. How much more can we do the same in our own lives, our work, our community, and our neighborhoods? Because the world needs our lives.